How does a person go from being an heiress and a victim of a violent crime, then to a willing participant in an armed robbery? A person who chooses to raise a rifle and threaten the lives of strangers. We will examine the psychological mechanics of trauma, captivity, and transformation, revealing the chilling behavioral clues that tell the story of the mind under extreme duress. Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Patricia Hearst case. I will be focusing on the mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations. It's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. It was the evening of February 4th, 1974 in Berkeley, California, when the peace of an ordinary Monday night was shattered at a home to a 19-year-old Patricia Hearst, granddaughter of the legendary publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, and her fiancé, Stephen Weed. 3 armed members of the domestic revolutionary group, the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, burst into the apartment. Their target was Patricia, a representative of the wealth and power that they despised. They assaulted Stephen and violently dragged Patricia, clothed only in a nightgown, out of her apartment, forcing her into the trunk of a car before speeding away. This abduction immediately became a national sensation, not just because of the victim's prominent family name, but because the psychology of this kidnapping would soon become one of the most debated subjects in forensic mental health. The first psychological red flag is the immediate and absolute sensory deprivation and tactic of a psychological warfare. From the moment of her capture, Patricia Hearst was subjected to what is called coercive persuasion, or brainwashing. For approximately 57 days, she was held in a small dark closet, often blindfolded, a state of profound sensory deprivation. This isolation is a powerful psychological tool designed to strip away the victim's reality and sense of self. It's a calculated act to dismantle their foundational identity, leaving them vulnerable to a new influence. When the external world is reduced to a constant state of fear and darkness, the mind desperately seeks structure, even if that structure is provided by the captors. This sets the stage for the first key mental health indicator, the beginning of trauma bonding. This initial period of captivity is where the foundational psychological damage occurs, planting the seed for a distorted future reality. The SLA was not a large group, but they were highly organized in their radical ideology, led by a convicted murderer who had escaped from prison, Donald DeFries, who went by the name Field Marshal Sink. They demanded that Patricia's father distribute $2 million in food to the poor of California in exchange for her safe return. This was a complex demand, putting the wealthy family in an agonizing position. They attempted to comply, but the food giveaway, which occurred in February 1974, was marred by chaos, rioting, and fraud at various distribution sites. The second psychological red flag is alternating between extreme abuse and small controlled acts of kindness by the abuser. After weeks of being confined to the closet and allegedly subjected to both verbal and sexual abuse, her physical confinement was eased. This sudden change from absolute terror and darkness to controlled interaction can be profoundly disorienting. The captors transition from pure threat to, in their warped view, a source of light and structure. A victim experiencing this intense shift may unconsciously interpret the cessation of pain or the slight easing of restrictions as an act of grace, which can trigger the initial stages of a trauma bond, leading to intense cognitive dissonance. The mind struggles to reconcile "my captor is evil and wants to hurt me" with "my captor gave me water and let me out of the closet." The easier psychological route is to adjust the perception of the captor. In April 1974, 2 months after the kidnapping, the SLA released an audio tape to the public. The voice on the tape was unmistakably Patricia's. In it, she announced that she had freely chosen to join the Symbionese Liberation Army, had adopted the revolutionary name Tanya, and was denouncing her former life, her fiancé, and her family. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Was this a genuine conversion, or was she speaking under duress? The shift in her public persona became terrifyingly concrete on April 15, 1974. Surveillance cameras at a bank in Sunset District of San Francisco captured the unimaginable. The footage showed a young woman, identified as Patricia Hearst, holding an M1 assault rifle, barking orders at customers and providing cover for her Confederates during the midday robbery. This was not a frightened victim from 2 months earlier. This was Tanya, the revolutionary. The third psychological red flag is the rapid and total adoption of a new extremist ideology and identity following extreme trauma. This dramatic transformation, captured on camera, is the classic yet extreme public display of what is now known as Stockholm Syndrome. This psychological phenomenon involves a captive developing a positive emotional bond or alliance with their captors, often seeing them as their only means of survival. The victim adopts the captor's perspective and rationale as a subconscious survival mechanism. In Patricia's case, the complete rejection of her old life and the militant embrace of the name Tanya served as a powerful declaration of her new allegiance, a public performance that psychologically reinforced her survival strategy. The former identity, one associated with helplessness and trauma, is shed for a new one associated with power and purpose within the confines of her captivity. This moment, frozen in time by the security camera, became the pivotal evidence that transformed her legal status from a victim to a criminal suspect in the eyes of the FBI. For the next year and a half, Patricia Hearst remained underground with the remaining members of the SLA. She was no longer just a figurehead on a tape, but an active fugitive participating in car bombings, shootouts, and other crimes. The FBI launched a massive manhunt, with Patricia becoming one of the most wanted fugitives in America. One notable incident occurred in Los Angeles on May 16, 1974, when 2 SLA members attempting to steal an ammunition belt were nearly caught, leading authorities to a new SLA safe house. The following day, a massive gun battle erupted between the Los Angeles Police Department and the occupants of the house. 6 SLA members were killed when the house went up in flames, including Donald DeFries. But Patricia and several others were not in there. They had escaped, and the saga continued. The fourth psychological red flag is continuing to commit criminal acts on behalf of the captors long after the original existential threat had been reduced or removed. The fact that Patricia Hearst did not flee during the chaos of the police shootout or in the many months that followed is a strong psychological indicator of the depth of her coercion. The loyalty exhibited is less about the true political belief and more about an extreme survival instinct compounded by trauma bonding. The captors have successfully convinced her that they are her only protection against the outside world, the police and the government, and even her own family, whom she had publicly denounced. They had created a closed system of reality where only the SLA rules applied, making the thought of leaving feel more dangerous than staying. Her continued participation in the crime was a measure of her internal compliance and perceived necessity for life. Her time on the run finally ended on September 18, 1975, when the FBI located and arrested Patricia Hearst and the last remaining core of the SLA members in an apartment in the Outer Mission District of San Francisco. She was charged with bank robbery and the use of the firearm in the commission of a felony. The trial of Patricia Hearst began on February 4, 1976, 2 years after the day of her kidnapping. The central conflict in the courtroom and in the public mind was purely psychological. Was she a revolutionary terrorist acting on her own free will, Or was she a victim of coercive persuasion and a hostage driven to crime by a genuine profound fear for her life? Her defense, led by famed attorney F. Lee Bailey, argued for her acquittal based on the then novel and controversial defense of Stockholm syndrome and brainwashing. The fifth psychological red flag is the difficulty of distinguishing between free will and psychological compulsion in a victim of mind control. The trial highlighted the extreme challenge of defining duress in a court of law, especially when coercion is psychological rather than purely physical at the moment of the crime. Defense experts, including psychiatrists and psychologists, testified that the brutality of her initial confinement, followed by constant threats and ideological indoctrination, had rendered her mentally incapable of making free choices. They presented a case for disassociation, suggesting that the persona of Tanya was a survival mechanism, an artificially created compliant self that acted to protect the underlying terrified Patricia. The prosecution, however, focused on her apparent agency and zeal during the bank robbery, using her own tapes and surveillance footage against her. The jury faced an unprecedented task of weighing objective criminal acts against subjective psychological trauma. How much time must pass before the defense of coercion expires? If she participated willingly or even with enthusiasm, does the origin of that enthusiasm matter? The sixth psychological red flag here is how pre-existing public perceptions and social economic status can psychologically influence the assessment of the victim's credibility. It's crucial to consider the potential for social and class bias in the jury's decision. Patricia Hearst was the granddaughter of the media mogul, a symbol of extreme wealth and privilege. For many, her transformation was not seen as a tragic descent into mental servitude, but as a callous betrayal of her class, or perhaps a social rich girl's dramatic indulgence in a revolutionary trend. This societal judgment may have led to a collective unwillingness to accept the defense of brainwashing, which could be perceived as an elaborate excuse only available to the wealthy. This psychological lens may have made the jurors less empathetic to the idea that trauma could be that absolute. They essentially asked, doesn't a privileged person have more psychological strength? In March 1976, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Patricia Hearst was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. She served nearly 2 years before her sentence was commuted by President Jimmy Carter in 1979. She later received a full presidential pardon from President Bill Clinton in 2001. The case remained a powerful psychological touchstone, forcing a broader conversation about victimology and accountability. The seventh psychological red flag is a lifetime of legal and public scrutiny and the psychological impact of having to perpetually explain an altered state of mind. Even after her release, the mental health implications of the case do not end. She carried the immense weight of her conviction, not just the legal consequence, but the psychological burden of a public identity that was inextricably linked to Tanya and the SLA. For any victim of extreme coercion, the process of reintegrating a fractured self is complex. There's often the need to repress the Tanya persona, the part of the self that participated in the violence, in order to reclaim the Patricia who was the victim. This kind of intense psychological repression, while necessary for societal reentry, can lead to long-term mental health challenges, including post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic feelings of emotional numbness or disassociation. The individuals who made up the Symbionese Liberation Army demonstrated a profound set of psychological indicators themselves, which are important to understand the overall dynamic of the case. While their revolutionary ideology was public, their individual psychologies exhibited key behavioral red flags, which leads to the eighth and final psychological red flag here: extreme grandiosity, rigid black and white thinking, and the use of violence to justify a moral superiority. The leaders of the SLA, particularly Donald DeFreeze, operated with a rigid, almost cult-like structure, exhibiting clear signs of malignant narcissism and antisocial personality traits. They demanded absolute allegiance to an incoherent ideology, using violence and fear to maintain control. Their worldview was purely dichotomous. Their cause was good, and everything else was evil. This allows them to commit heinous acts such as kidnapping and murder while maintaining a sense of moral rectitude. Patricia, an emotionally vulnerable person under duress, became a powerful symbol and psychological trophy. Her conversion validated their perceived power and their ideology, reinforcing their pathological grandiosity. The captors saw her not as a human being, but as a tool to advance their warped cause, a strong indicator of their own psychological detachment from reality and empathy. The Patricia Hearst case remains a complex and traumatic testament to the fragility of the human mind under prolonged distress and the devastating power of psychological manipulation. It compels us to ask difficult questions about where victimhood ends and culpability begins. The case forces us to look beyond the surface actions and truly grapple with the invisible violence that can destroy a person's free will. We now know Stockholm Syndrome is a very real psychological indicator. It happens more than you realize in cases of kidnapping. I did a video a few months ago about Sean Hornbeck and Ben, and they were captured by their kidnapper for years, and they complied with their captor. It happens often when somebody is under duress and they feel like their life is going to end if they don't convert. You can't blame the victim. You have to look beyond their actions, because so often for the victim, if they commit these crimes as Patricia did, they're doing it to protect themselves, not because they believe in their captor. And so that's something that we really have to consider. It makes this case very complex. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.